Hello, welcome to the 2025 GCSE AQA Psychology Paper 1 predicted questions video. I know you've been waiting for it, so let's get into it. So first off, like I did last year, I'll start this video by saying I don't think you should rely on predictions, 100% not. They're very inaccurate generally, and you're much better off covering all the content, making sure you know it really well, and doing lots of past papers, doing lots of active revision. That works really, really well. However, like I said last year, the whole reason I do make these videos, if I don't, someone else does. I know there's a few others out there, and if there are things that are right, like I did get last year, it's probably because something called confirmation bias. So where you then look back and things are accurate. What you can see on the screen there, a few of the reviews. Thanks, like, rate, subscribe. For my videos for last year. So actually I did get a fair few correct. Now that could just be fluke, it could be confirmation bias, or there could be something in it, who knows. But yeah, don't just rely on the predictions is all I'm saying. You can use them as a good tool maybe to look at some of the things that you might not have looked at otherwise. So first thing, getting into the memory topic. So last year there was a memory 9 marker, 2024. It was the War of the Ghosts, or reconstructing memory was the 9 marker. So again, there's no actual science in this, but we could say that maybe that means there's less of a chance of a 9 marker this year because there was one last year. So I'm going to say maybe there might not be a 9 mark on the memory topic. The encoding, storage and retrieval, those questions haven't come up that often, so you might get something on there, maybe a bit of AO1 I've said on there. Primacy and recency has come up, so it has previously been 2019, it was a 9 marker. There were some longer questions there in 2022, and there was a short answer last year, so maybe that might come up as an application. Doesn't look like it's come up before as an application question, so we'll have a look at that. As I said, reconstructing memory, War of the Ghosts came up last year. The other bits, the last part of the topic, so factors affecting memory, interference, context, false memory, those are bits always good to know. As you can see, context came up as there was a 2 marker on context last year, so interference might be good to know. My outside bet is false memory. I haven't seen many questions come up on false memory, so that might be a good one to know, certainly for AO1. And let's have a look at what some of the application questions on that one might be. So yeah, as I said, just know maybe the definitions of encoding, storage and retrieval. That might be good to know. That might be a 2 marker on any one of those. Outline Murdoch study into the primacy and recency effect. Evaluate the research methods using that study. So yeah, well worth knowing that study. Also, as I said, there can be some applications. So you might get a question if I show you the next one. Something like this. So I've made this up completely, but James was revising for a psychology exam. He spent 10 minutes learning a list of research methods terminology. When he went to write down the words he could remember, he found that the words at the start of the list, such as independent variable, and the words at the end of the list, such as normal distribution, he remembered those better than words in the middle, such as natural observation. What are the primacy and recency effects? Refer to the passage above in your answer. So that would be an AO2 question. You'd need to know some of the AO1 for the first part of that question, but obviously you'd then have to apply that. Don't forget, when you're doing your application questions, use things from the STEM in your answer. So talk about James, talk about the research methods terms at the start of the list. That may be going into long-term memory, so that's the primacy effect, and words at the end of the list like normal distribution, that would still be in short-term memory, so that's the recency effect. So using your knowledge as application there, AO1 and AO2. And then the other one, I think I used this last year actually, kind of false memory. So you need to know what false memories are, but you could get, again, I've given you another scenario one, twinned it in with some research methods. As I'm going to say in the research methods topic, research methods you just need to know through all of paper 1. It's obviously got its own section in paper 1. Really hard to predict questions, but you definitely are going to get some research methods questions coming up, and they could be within the other topics, especially maybe if there's not a 9 marker in this topic. So this is an example, treatment for obesity. This actually happened, by the way. The treatment for obesity, psychologists use false memories to reduce consumption of junk food. So like the Lost in the Mall study, rather than telling people that they got lost in a mall when they were younger, they told them that they didn't like particular food, ice cream, junk food, and it actually reduced the consumption. So there's that research methods question there. So you can pause this, have a read of that, and maybe give that question a go. Next then, perception. So perception, there were a few questions last year, but there wasn't a 9 marker on perception last year, so maybe there will be this year. If there were to be, my outside bet would be Gregory's constructivist theory. I couldn't find any 9 markers when I was going through them. Again, I might have missed them, but not from what I see. So discuss or outline, evaluate Gregory's theory. I'll show you another example of that. Could be a synoptic question, so worth looking at those. The other bits, explaining visual illusions, yeah, they come up every now and again. Haven't had an application one there, so that's worth looking at. Fair few perception questions came up last year. The one bit that maybe hasn't, Brunner and Minturn, that did come up as a 9 marker 3 years ago, but yes, certainly worth knowing still, and maybe just evaluation on that one. So this is my outside bet at a and synoptic and application 9 marker. Now, I don't know if they'd do that. That would be quite harsh, but let's prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Simba did not grow up in a city and struggled to understand things that appear small, might just be far away. When Simba first heard a story set in a city, he misremembered it when trying to recall it. For example, recalling a field instead of a park and a lake instead of a pond. Discuss Gregory's constructivist theory of perception and Bartlett's reconstructive theory of memory. Refer to Simba's experience in your answer. So there's a lot going on there. As I said, I doubt that would come up, but good to know maybe what an application question might look like in the constructivist theory question, and also how it can link to other topics. So the other topics, constructivist theory, Gregory's theory, links to any areas where they say the environment and culture has an effect. So Bartlett obviously said that in memory. So those two could go together quite nicely for a synoptic question. And then here, as I said, I've given you an example. I use Simba like the Lion King. And use Simba as an example there. And there have been questions like this before. You might have seen it spoke about boys in growing up in a city, a rural area or not. So seeing how that could affect it. If you get a discuss question, it's the same as outline and evaluate. So you'd have to approach this question by talking about Gregory's constructivist theory, talk about inferences. As AO1, you'd have to talk about Bartlett's reconstructive theory, so talk about memory being inaccurate, and that there's this effort after meaning. Discuss is also evaluate, so you can evaluate those two things. As I said, that's probably why it wouldn't be a synoptic and an application question, because you're spreading yourself a bit thin. But yeah, talking about the evaluation of those things. So for example, Gregory's theory does help us to explain visual illusions, which is a positive. However, how often do we actually experience ambiguous tasks in the real world? So maybe an artificial task. And then you'd have to apply it to Simba. So you'd need to talk about Simba misremembering things because he's not been in a city. He doesn't know what a pond or a park is because he won't have seen those things. Think of, I don't know, Hyde Park in London, or any park really. What am I thinking of? A big park in New York. Grand Central. No, that's the station. Central Park, that's the one. So yeah, he wouldn't have seen a pond, but might have seen natural forms like fields or lakes. So again, referring to the stem in your answer. And then here, perception again, how would psychologists explain it? So this is the how question. I've linked it to Brunner and Minturn here. So because it's an ambiguous task, that's kind of the explanation, is ambiguity. It can be seen as a B or a 13. And then evaluating the task, so nice control, but it's an artificial task, artificial environment. So you could talk about those sorts of things. Okay, and development or developmental psychology. Again, there was a 9 marker in this one last year. So that was the looking at brain and neurodevelopment, things like that. It was linked to one of the other topics. So may or may not. If there were a 9 marker on this, Hughes hasn't come up as a 9 marker. There was in 2020 exams that didn't happen. It was a 4 and a 5 marker. So essentially a 9 marker, so could come up as a 9 marker in that regard. Yeah, the application, the only reason I put applying Piaget to education, I don't actually think that will come up as a 9 marker. What the spec says is the name studies, so McGarrigle, Donaldson, Hughes, and then the theories. The key theories here are Piaget's theory as a whole, and then Dweck's theory and Willingham's theory. So they're more likely to come up as 9 markers. The only reason I highlighted applying Piaget to education is because it does come up fairly often, and if you can prepare for a 9 marker in it, then you can tackle anything in that one. So yeah, that's not actually a necessary prediction, but just kind of highlighting that not to forget revising that side of things. I say maybe think about Dweck, outline, evaluate Dweck's theory. Dweck's come up a couple of times as a 9 marker, as you can see there, 2020, 2022, and Willingham's come up before. Again, that might be a good outside shot, Willingham's theory. So here, scenario and application of schemas. Yeah, I haven't actually given you a scenario there, but there are examples of, there's some in the textbooks you might have used of children learning what bees and what flies are, and changing their schemas. And there have been other ones. There's one in one of the past papers about Megan and her dad and seeing a donkey for the first time and changing her schema. So that's how an application question would come up on schemas. Outline and evaluate the impact of Piaget's theory of cognitive development on education. As I said, probably not going to come up as a 9 marker, but maybe think about how you would answer that one. So your AO1, you need to talk about readiness, discovery learning, a child-centered approach. You could also link it to the stages of development. So what are the children doing in those particular stages? You could then evaluate it as a general evaluation of Piaget's theory. So good strength, so that there's application there, the Plowden report, how it's been used in the real world. Weakness maybe on some of the research that was done. It was quite focused on Western ideals and his own children and things like that. So yeah, just think about that one. And then what I've given you here is a application 9 marker. So I've got Shub. Shub was asked to hide a boy teddy from a toy teddy. From a toy monkey. He was not able to do this when he was 3 years old, but by the time he was 7, he was able to do this. Discuss, use policeman style study, refer to Shub in your answer. So yeah, be aware of 9 mark application questions. They're normally 3-3-3 in terms of AO1, AO2, AO3. So you'd need to talk about Hughes's policeman style study. Remember, A, method, results, conclusion. You would need to evaluate Hughes's policeman style study, strengths and weaknesses, the fact that it criticised Piaget in terms of how egocentric the children were, but supported Piaget in terms of the stages. But you'd also need to do some AO2. So you need to talk about Shub, how Shub is really silly when he's 3 and he can't hide the doll, and how he's developing his egocentrism in his pre-operational stage, and then by the end of that stage, or start of the concrete operational stage, he's developed, he's less egocentric, and so he is able to do that task. Last but not least, research methods. There's almost no point in trying to predict research methods. So much comes up every year. Don't forget, research methods can come up in every topic. So even on paper 1, you can get it in the memory, development and perception topics. It's obviously got its own section in paper 1, and then comes up all through paper 2 as well. Again, I'm sure there are bits missing here from the different papers, but yeah, you've got there pretty much coverage of most things most of the time. The only bit that I haven't seen come up as often as I would expect is probably observations. I said this about reliability and validity last year. Reliability and validity is again another one that's worth looking at. If you look at that, I've only seen really one question come up on that properly, and that was last year. So that might come up again, worth going over that. Observations, be quite sure on your observations, because that one hasn't come up that often either. Case studies, again, doesn't come up that often, so it's an outside bet. Things to look at here though are things that do come up quite often. Designer studies come up. I'm sure I'm missing some there from 2019, 20 and 2021. They come up really regularly, so know your designer study questions. And then data and graphs, loads of data and graphs questions every year, so make sure you know how to draw a graph. Don't forget your title, labeling your axes, knowing the difference between a histogram, a bar chart and a scatter graph. Yeah, really worth knowing there. And then yeah, make sure you know what's the difference between significant figures and decimal points are. They're quite common things that trip people up each year. So yeah, just a couple of bits there. So how can psychologists ensure inter-observer reliability? That's one. That's kind of mixing the reliability and the observation question. So you'd need to talk there about having 2 different observers. Behavioural categories is a big thing for observations as well. So how do you know what you're looking at? So if you're looking at, I don't know, aggressive behaviour with school children, what do you mean by aggressive behaviour? You're going to have to operationalise your behavioural categories. So if you're saying that punching, kicking, hitting, pushing are aggressive acts, then you need to be quite quite clear about that. You need to train your observers, and then you need to test their inter-observer reliability. So if one observer is rating a child as 8 out of 10 aggressive, the other one should also be rating it 8 out of 10. You should have a positive correlation between your observers. That's how you test inter-observer reliability. And then give one strength and one weakness of a case study. Yeah, so you can talk about that. So things linked to case studies. It's a small scale study of an individual or small group. Often they're longitudinal, so you can see changes over time, which is really positive. Sometimes the researcher can get too involved, which might be seen as a negative. And as I said there, I've got the kind of design a study and the graphs questions because they come up really regularly. So make sure you know your stuff there. Best of luck for paper 1. Hope it goes well.